Thank you for joining me. These are Day Texts with Greg Stafford. We meet every Monday morning, I should say every weekday morning at 5 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, unless otherwise scheduled, so that we can consider a portion of the biblical record and other ancient histories or sources of knowledge and wisdom, often that are contemporaneous with the Bible or some of the biblical books or letters, so that we can learn about our history, specifically about biblical history and related literature, and then apply the things that we learn throughout our day, hence day texts. Of course, we have people around the earth that are joining us, so it may be evening where you are, in which case it could be an evening text. It's meant to apply for the entire day, or even something to wake up with. So we're working our way through the New Testament. We're in the book or letter of 2 Timothy. It's a little dark in the mornings, of course, because it's 5 a.m. where I am. And so it kind of fits the feel, I guess you could say, of the early morning atmosphere for people, similar to what we read about in some of the early sources about Christians and their activities, like in Pliny's letter to Trajan, when he wrote about how the Christians would meet early every morning before sunrise and consider various things, what to do and not do throughout their day. So we don't base the day text shows on that, but they're consistent with it. And so having done it for a little while now, I can appreciate meeting together early in the morning to start your day on a spiritual note. So that's why I do these day texts. And as I mentioned, we're working our way through the New Testament. So we'll continue through to the end of the book of Revelation, according to the text that I've translated to date in the Great Message translation. And then we'll reset, go back to Genesis, and work our way through that book. But we're still in 2 Timothy chapter 2. And I'm going to go ahead and read today's text here in just a moment. Good morning, Zhuzhen. So today's text, I've already embedded it in the description below. So you should be able to see what we're going to read at least several hours or a day. I try to put it up as early as possible in advance. And then if you have any questions or if you want to make any comments in the chat, feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll read the text, make a brief application, and then we'll be on our way. Okay, so 2 Timothy chapter 2, I'm going to read verses 23 through 26, and then we'll make a brief application. Okay, so starting in verse 23, Paul's writing to Timothy, a young Greek man who had converted to Christianity. And of course, Paul was a Jew who converted to Christianity as well. So he's writing to Timothy about some of the conditions in the first century, things that he as a young Christian man would have to deal with. And so he says in verse 23, also, you must not put up with idiotic and ignorant controversies or debates, since you have learned these beget fights. Verse 24, to the contrary, it is not necessary for a servant of the Lord to fight. Rather, the servant of the Lord should be gentle to all, ready to teach, tolerant. And that's not always easy, I know. We'll talk more about it in a moment. Let's finish with the text though, verse 25. With humility, the servant of the Lord should correct those who are acting like enemies. Perhaps God may give them a change of heart to recognize the truth. And now, let's see, final verse, verse 26. Then they might wake up from the devil's trap, as they have been caught by the devil for that one's desire. So notice here that the context of these verses has to do with debates, fights, and correcting people who are acting like enemies. Very difficult to do, right? I mean, we even have instances where Jesus refers to the scribes and Pharisees as serpents, vipers, whitewashed graves with dead men's bones inside. And of course, there are other accounts in the Bible where people are accused of mistreating others and spoken of in harsh terms for opposing the Christians. But that's not the most common type of description we're given as a result of the conversations that Jesus and the early Christians had. Most often, they are correcting people gently, helping people to recognize the truth. It's just that when you're dealing with so many people, not everybody is going to have the same level of appreciation for what you're doing. Or they may disagree with you to such an extent that you end up fighting with that person versus trying to help the other people there. So it's very important for us, especially today, because we get into so many potential arguments and debates about the meaning of ancient words, ancient texts, and really most of them are not that difficult to understand. It's just that the beliefs of some have developed around certain understandings or traditions that complicate the otherwise clear meaning of these texts. So you could have a text like John 1:1 that is so simple and clear, and yet it is complicated beyond what we could even have imagined, I'm sure, if we were alive in the first century and reading what John wrote, that we would think we would ever have to deal with the Trinity or something like that, where God is redefined as person in almost every instance, unless it refers to the Trinity in their view. And so you go through this wholesale reinterpretation of words and ideas just to fit a doctrine that came about hundreds of years later. Doesn't matter if it was brought about to try to resolve what they perceive to be a problem with monotheism. All it has done since then is produce fights and arguments rather than a clear understanding of Jah, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. So you could spend your whole life arguing with those same people and probably make no progress whatsoever. And a lot of people do that. They'll spend their whole life arguing with other people who claim to believe in Jesus like you, but rather than help other people who have no knowledge of Jesus or Jah, they'll spend all their time, most of their time and energy, arguing with other people who claim they believe in Jesus. And so you see what happens? They get caught. It's a trap. It is a trap. It says right here, if you don't believe me, verse 26, they might wake up from the devil's trap. He's trapping you. He is trapping every one of you into these ridiculous debates, these ongoing arguments. And it says right here, this must be the 5th or 6th time that Paul has brought this up and said, stop arguing, stop debating, stop fighting. And he couldn't say it more clearly. He could say it more times, but how many times does it have to be said? I would think once is enough. But it obviously isn't enough, right? Because look at what people do today. Sometimes we have to, right? When I was with the Watchtower, we were under constant assault by Trinitarians and others claiming that we had a Bible that was lying to people, mistranslated. You had to stand up for yourself as a member of the Watchtower Society because you were attacked on a non-stop on almost every issue. So that's not the idea, though. The idea is not to create a group or religious association so that you can come up with all kinds of controversial beliefs and translations and then argue with people non-stop. That's why I'm happy not to be a part of that anymore. You see, I will argue, I will debate if I feel it's necessary to establish a point or position to help people. But this ongoing arguing and fighting over idiotic and ignorant controversies, things like evolution, the trend, these are all idiotic. Evolution is ridiculous, has no scientific evidence. All existing scientific evidence contradicts it. Yet look at all these so-called smart people. And then you have Trinitarians who non-stop want to argue with you about metaphysics, the thing they know least about, being physical creatures. And it's non-stop with them when it comes to non-Trinitarians. Same with Watchtower people and others who constantly want to promote the governing body, fight for the sake of human beings who've made more mistakes than I can probably even count. Doesn't matter if they're false prophets or not, they should not be promoting themselves the way that they're doing. They should show humility and stop putting themselves above other people. But all they do is set up situations for people to fight for them, fight over Jah, rather than try to help people and correct those who might recognize the truth. Very difficult. I mentioned the other day I got into a discussion with a lady. I couldn't even get an answer to one question. So it didn't matter how gentle I tried to be. It didn't matter if I tried to approach her with a question based on what we were there to look at and talk about. The whole purpose of being together was to talk about something. And the second I started to talk about it, she broke down. So we cannot always effectively be gentle towards others, meaning that they're not always going to just respond because we're being gentle or trying to ask a question. They might perceive our question as something threatening because they don't have an answer and they know it. And so there are reasons why people react the way they do. And so do not become disheartened if, even though you try, things don't work out. You could try, you could plan to be as gentle and reasonable as possible, but that doesn't mean other people are going to respond in the same way. So nevertheless, you have the option of removing yourself from that kind of situation most of the time. I couldn't really remove myself the other day. I kind of separated. But the point is, we should try. Try to be gentle toward all, ready to teach, and tolerant. I do try. I try all the time. And I usually succeed. But we will not always succeed. So don't let that make you disheartened toward what we're reading about here. Try to find the people, even if they're enemies, whom you can teach or correct in a gentle way without compromising your spirit. It may happen. It will happen at times. But more often than not, by far, you should be able to reflect the spirit of Jesus and the early Christians in trying to help people. Our message is one of peace and love. But because we are enemies of the world, or those who oppose Jah and Jesus make us enemies, and so in effect we are enemies of them to the extent that they see us as enemies. We just are going to have to deal with those kinds of circumstances as best we can. And if we find we're in a situation with someone who's clearly there to fight, try to get yourself out of there as quickly as possible. You are about to be caught in a trap, fighting with somebody else who's not going to listen to you anyway, and who's supposed to be out there praising Jah like you. So the devil has a number of different tactics, most of which we don't see coming, even though we can recognize, if we consider what the texts tell us and we think about the things that are happening. But they're not so obvious and easy. He's not a dummy. Not a dummy in the sense that he hasn't gained knowledge and experience sufficient to trap us if we're not careful. And so that's why I review these texts, so we remember. And we're ready if we should find ourselves in these circumstances. Or if we make a mistake and we got caught in a trap, now, next time, we'll be ready. So, how to be a part of our church? Well, we're the Christian witnesses of Jah. So really, you just have to believe three things. I'm responding. There's a question in the chat. How to be a part of our group or church? We're a group of people who believe in three things. Jah is the only true God. Jesus is the one he sent forth as the Messiah in fulfillment of writings like what Moses spoke of in Deuteronomy 18, Isaiah chapter 9, Isaiah 53, and a variety of other texts that speak of the coming of the Messiah, Zechariah 12:10. And our third thing is we treat others the way we want to be treated. That's it. We all have other beliefs, obviously, about things like prophecy, chronology, but we don't promote them because they beget fights, just like today's text states, right? Why fight over our view of a prophecy or our view of chronology, unless it's something we can show historically, like Jesus' birth and the divisions of the priestly service? Sometimes things like that can be helpful, especially when you're dealing with Jews who accept that kind of history. But more often than not, if you get involved in those discussions, they're going to take you away from the primary things, Jah, Jesus, and other people. So why spend your time arguing over whether we should consider ourselves in the last days or how soon Armageddon's coming? These kinds of questions are destabilizing. They destabilize your thinking. They might provide some motivation through fear, but it's not healthy because it's not based on a genuine appreciation for the truth and love for Jah. That should be your primary motivation. These other things are going to happen either way, right? So we should focus on each day that Jah gives us to give him praise. Then it won't matter when these days come or if we die before they come. We will be in Jah's memory. Our spirit will be with him, and he will give us back our life with a new body when he chooses. That's our hope. Focus on that. And don't let all these other things distract you, especially if you've already spent time or others have already spent a lot of time debating or establishing the truth, right? Because otherwise, you're just going to beget fights. And that's not our purpose. It says right there, it's not necessary, verse 24, for a servant of the Lord to fight. While it may not be necessary, even there are times when we may be compelled to because circumstances are forced upon us. Other than that, it's really not necessary. We're there to try to reach people whom the Father is calling through the Son to him. So we should be looking for those people, trying to help them come to the Father through Jesus. So another question is, am I a Jehovah's Witness? Well, of course I am. By definition, I bear witness to Jah, Jehovah, the God of the Bible. That's what a Jehovah's Witness is. A Jehovah's Witness is not someone who bears witness to others like the Watchtower Society. I'm not saying the Watchtower hasn't done good or doesn't do some good, but the fact is they're not Jah. They're not Jesus, and they've made a lot of mistakes that show they're not who they think they are. And so I leave them be. I'm focused on Jah, Jesus, and you and me. So I am a Jehovah's Witness in that I bear witness to Jehovah or Jah. And those who support the Watchtower Society are only Jehovah's Witnesses if they also bear witness to Jehovah, not to men. If your witness to God is contingent upon your acceptance of other humans, you're not a Jehovah's Witness. All right, so I hope that was some good information for all of you today. Thank you for joining me. I will be back tomorrow. We're continuing to work our way through 2 Timothy. So be sure to join me again at 5 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll go through another set of day text verses. And until then, may Jah bless you in Jesus' name. Thank you.